Canada is always sold as a paradise, a first world country, clean streets, a very high quality of life, and a universal health system. But behind this impeccable image lies a crisis that is getting worse every year. Inequality is growing, the cost of living is skyrocketing, and the number of people living on the streets is reaching record levels. What few people see are the huge queues at food banks, the neighborhoods overrun with drug users, and the overcrowded shelters where entire families try to survive. Fentanyl, a lethal opioid, has spread to such an extent that some towns look like they've come out of a post-apocalyptic movie. To make matters worse, indigenous communities face conditions worthy of underdeveloped countries, marked by misery, abandonment, and violence. While photos of crystal-clear lakes and organized cities circulate around the world, a growing part of the population struggles to pay rent, buy food, and simply have a safe place to sleep. Today on Bello Mundo, we delve into the part that travel guides don't show. Do you want to understand how, in such a rich country, so many people can live in a situation of vulnerability? Then, come along and be surprised by Canada's dark side. Number 1. Location and general data. Canada may be huge, but not everyone lives the same reality. On the one hand, we have cities like Toronto, Montreal, and Vancouver, symbols of modernity and quality of life. On the other, entire communities face isolation, exorbitant prices, and poor infrastructure. The country is divided into 10 provinces and 3 territories, and this division goes far beyond geography. In British Columbia, the climate is milder, while in cities like Winnipeg and Edmonton, the winters are so brutal that outdoor life becomes impossible. In the far north, the cold is so severe that few manage to stay there without government support. And speaking of the government, Canada is rich in natural resources: oil, minerals, fresh water, endless forests. But the distribution of this wealth is extremely unequal. In isolated communities, especially in indigenous areas, a single gallon of milk can cost up to 5 times more than in Toronto. Transportation for essential goods is expensive, and those who live in these places have to choose between eating or paying for heating in winter. At the same time, big cities are becoming increasingly unaffordable for those who are not part of the financial elite. Sky-high rents, expensive transportation, and salaries that don't keep up with the cost of living mean that thousands of people end up with no options. Poverty and desperation have grown to such an extent that in some neighborhoods, the scene of people living on the streets has become part of everyday life. Canada may seem like a perfect country on social media, but if you look closely, you can see a chasm between those who thrive and those who try day after day just to survive. And this absurd contrast is just the beginning of what we're about to explore. Number 2. History. Canada's official history is full of patriotic pride, but you only have to look closer to realize that this narrative hides dark episodes. Before the Europeans arrived, these lands were already inhabited by countless indigenous nations with rich cultures, languages, and traditions. But colonization didn't just come with trade and settlements. It brought extermination, marginalization, and brutal attempts to erase these peoples from history. With the expansion of British and French rule, Canada began to shape itself as a federation, gaining political autonomy, but retaining deep scars in society. One of the cruelest marks of this history was the system of indigenous residential schools. Children were torn from their families and forced to forget their identity, suffering physical and psychological abuse in boarding schools that had a single goal: to destroy any trace of their culture. Decades later, the government apologized, but the consequences still weigh heavily on indigenous communities, who face the worst rates of poverty, alcoholism, and suicide in the country. And that wasn't the only stain on Canadian history. During the Great Wars, the country put citizens of German, Japanese, and Ukrainian descent in prison camps without trial, simply because of their ethnicity. For decades, blacks, Chinese, and other minorities were barred from immigration with racist laws, stating that they would not adapt to the local climate and culture. Canada loves to sell the image of an inclusive, multicultural, and egalitarian nation. And indeed, progress has been made. The country has laws protecting human rights, acknowledges past mistakes, and implements social programs. But structural inequalities are still huge and increasingly evident. And one of these inequalities is directly reflected in the economy. Number 3. Income inequality. Many people associate Canada with prosperity, good infrastructure, and stable jobs. And that's obviously true. After all, we're talking about one of the richest countries in the world. But the other truth is that the country has been facing an alarming increase in income inequality, especially after some periods of economic crisis and global instability. While a portion of the population enjoys very high salaries, luxury properties, and investments, entire groups struggle to survive amid the high cost of living. Recent figures show that the richest 1% own around a quarter of the country's wealth, while almost half of the population has virtually no significant assets. To make matters worse, the cost of housing has become prohibitive in major centers such as Toronto, Vancouver, and Montreal. Wages are not keeping up with inflation, and rents and real estate prices have risen at an insane rate. For many ordinary workers, owning their own home is almost as far away as winning the lottery. The service sector, which has historically employed a large part of the workforce, has suffered greatly from recent crises, such as the COVID-19 pandemic. Small businesses and restaurants have closed their doors, leaving a huge contingent of unemployed or underemployed people. The problem is that at the same time as jobs are disappearing, the market is demanding more sophisticated qualifications, especially in technology and finance. Those who don't have access to expensive courses or the time to study are left out. For those who can't, income barely covers basic expenses. Queues at food banks have grown, and the economic strain is affecting people's mental health. In a country where meritocracy is sold as an absolute truth, the reality is quite different. Hard work is no longer a guarantee of a decent life, and inequality continues to grow at an alarming rate. Number 4. Food insecurity. It may sound contradictory to think that a country with as many supermarket chains, farms, and natural resources as Canada faces glaring food insecurity. But this is the reality for millions of people across the country. It's not just about not having enough to eat, but also not having access to healthy, nutritious food. Food banks and soup kitchens are becoming increasingly crowded, showing that even those who have a steady job sometimes can't afford the basics at the end of the month. In isolated regions or in the far north, such as Nunavut, Yukon, and the Northwest Territories, the situation is even more drastic. When winter hits, much of the transportation of supplies depends on air travel, which makes everything more expensive. There are reports of families paying exorbitant prices for basic items such as fruit, vegetables, and meat. Just to give you an idea, in some areas, a simple watermelon can cost more than 50 Canadian dollars, which is around 200 reais. Economic precariousness coupled with these surreally high costs means that many indigenous communities depend on government subsidy programs that don't always deliver. Many indigenous communities end up stuck with nutrient-poor diets, consuming ultra-processed and cheap food, which leads to serious health problems such as diabetes and obesity. debt has also become part of this equation. To put food on the table, many families resort to credit, accumulating interest that quickly spirals out of control. And while inflation continues to crush purchasing power, the false promise that all you have to do is work hard to have a comfortable life is crumbling in the face of reality. But this is not the only serious social problem in the country. Number 5. Fentanyl and other drug epidemic. Another dark and little talked about part of Canada is the epidemic of illicit substances. The opioid crisis in Canada has become a real social nightmare, and fentanyl is at the center of this tragedy. This synthetic substance, which is up to 50 times more potent than heroin, is causing an alarming number of overdoses across the country. The problem is that many victims don't even know they're using fentanyl, as dealers mix the drug with other substances to make it cheaper to produce and increase users' dependence. The result? An explosion in the number of deaths. Since 2006, more than 30,000 people have lost their lives to opioids in Canada, and British Columbia leads this macabre ranking. Vancouver, in particular, has become a symbol of the social collapse caused by the epidemic. The street scene is devastating, people in trances, passed out on the sidewalks, or overdosing just a few meters from tourist sites. Many users didn't start out with illicit drugs. The gateway for many was legally prescribed painkillers. When they could no longer get the drugs through medical channels, they migrated to cheaper substances on the illegal market. In an attempt to contain the catastrophe, the government has adopted controversial measures, such as decriminalizing the possession of small quantities of drugs in some regions. It has also invested in harm reduction programs, distributing naloxone, a drug that reverses overdoses, and expanding supervised consumption rooms. Yes, Canada has 47 of these safe use rooms where users can consume drugs like heroin and cocaine under medical supervision. The aim is to prevent overdose deaths and reduce the spread of diseases caused by sharing contaminated needles. It sounds shocking, but this model has existed for over 30 years in countries such as Switzerland, Holland, Germany, Denmark, Spain, and Australia. Number 6. Downtown East Side, Vancouver, the Canadian slum. And speaking of the use of illicit substances, if there's one place that sheds light on this crisis of drugs, poverty, and abandonment in Canada, it's Vancouver's downtown East Side neighborhood. It's just a few blocks from trendy tourist areas like Gastown and Canada Place, but the contrast is stark. This is where the most shocking scenes of Canada's urban crisis are concentrated. Streets overrun with homeless people, injecting drug users, prostitution, and violence. The image of tents scattered on the sidewalks, syringes thrown on the ground, and people taking drugs in the open has become part of everyday life in the neighborhood, which has been nicknamed the Quadrilateral of Hell. In 2003, the local government opened the first safe drug use room in the area, which we've just talked about. The aim was to curb the number of deaths from overdoses and infections, such as HIV and hepatitis. But 2 decades later, although the rate of infections has fallen, the poverty in the neighborhood has only grown. Number 7. Excessive alcohol consumption. In addition to the fentanyl crisis, another issue that rarely comes up when talking about Canadians is the high consumption of alcohol. While craft breweries and bars drive the economy and are part of the lifestyle in many cities, excessive drinking has devastating consequences. Hospitals are seeing a worrying increase in hospitalizations for cirrhosis, pancreatitis, hypertension, and other alcohol-related diseases. Traffic accidents caused by drunk drivers continue to be one of the main causes of avoidable deaths in the country. The financial impact on the public health system is huge. The government spends billions of dollars every year treating medical complications caused by alcohol. Some proposals have suggested including warning labels on drinks, packaging, warning of the risks of cancer and cardiovascular disease, but the alcohol industry strongly resists these measures, fearing a drop in sales. Meanwhile, drinking culture remains normalized, and many underestimate the damage caused by frequent consumption. Among the most vulnerable, such as homeless people and those suffering from severe depression, alcohol becomes a quick escape from a difficult reality. But this temporary relief only deepens the crisis, leading to a vicious cycle of addiction and deteriorating health. The person drinks to forget their problems, but this only worsens their physical, emotional, and financial condition. Although there are government programs and NGOs trying to combat alcohol abuse, the solutions are still far from effective. The challenge is to balance recognition of the drinking culture with measures that really protect the population from the devastating impacts of excessive consumption. Number 8. The indigenous question and original peoples. By now, you've realized that not everything in Canada is as perfect as they say. But if there's one part of the population that's been feeling it for centuries, it's the indigenous peoples. As we said at the beginning of the video, the history of these communities is marked by abandonment, empty promises, and a systematic attempt to erase their cultures. The government even apologizes for the abuses committed in the past, but in practice, the reality remains cruel. Most indigenous communities live in isolated reserves, where basic sanitation, access to healthcare, and decent infrastructure are practically non-existent. Unemployment is high, school dropout remains a chronic problem, and, when an opportunity arises in the job market, prejudice still closes many doors. Not to mention that entire generations have grown up without being able to speak their languages or practice their traditions, the result of a forced policy of assimilation that has left deep traumas. And the problems don't stop there. Alcoholism and drug abuse are huge challenges, a reflection of a system that has marginalized these populations for decades. To make matters worse, mining and oil companies continue to exploit indigenous lands, pollute rivers, and destroy livelihoods, often without any kind of consultation or adequate compensation. The result is a cycle of exclusion which, despite all the talk of reconciliation, is still far from being broken. Number 9. Racism and discrimination. Now comes the talk that few want to admit. Canada does have a serious racism problem. The country likes to sell itself as an inclusive place that welcomes immigrants with open arms. But anyone who lives there knows that the reality is quite different. Black people report more frequent police approaches and fewer opportunities for career growth. Asian communities face increasingly common hate attacks, a problem that has exploded since the pandemic. And Islamophobia? It's still going strong too, with cases of discrimination and aggression against Muslims. The fact that protection laws exist doesn't mean that prejudice has disappeared. It has just become more subtle in some cases. But discrimination in the job market and in housing environments is still present, revealing that the land of inclusion still has a long way to go. Number 10. Social isolation and the situation of the elderly. Last but not least is a problem that no one usually associates with Canada, but which affects millions of people: loneliness. Around 40% of adults over the age of 50 feel isolated, and for the elderly, the situation is even worse. Many live alone, without family members nearby, trapped in tiny apartments or nursing homes where human contact is almost non-existent. When winter comes and the streets are covered in snow, getting out of the house becomes a challenge, and loneliness gets even worse. The COVID-19 pandemic has only worsened this scenario, closing social centers, limiting social interactions, and pushing many people into a cycle of isolation that has continued even after the restrictions have ended. Depression, anxiety, and even people taking their own lives are on the rise, and the lack of a support network makes it all the more difficult. And it's not just the elderly who suffer. Many immigrants who arrive in Canada in search of a better life end up facing cultural and linguistic barriers that make it difficult to create social ties. With no friends, no family nearby, and no sense of belonging, adapting can be much harder than you might think. Although the government talks about measures to encourage social integration, in practice there are still few solutions. Canada may have a reputation for being a welcoming country, but for many people, life there is marked by isolation. You can see that Canada is much more complex than the turquoise lakes and high standards of living that appear in tourist advertisements, can't you? Now it's up to you. Which of these realities surprised you the most? Leave a comment and share this content so that more people can get to know this other side of the country of dreams. Thank you very much for following us here, and we'll see you on our next adventure through our bello mundo, which is often not so bello.